The moment US forces struck Venezuela, the illusion collapsed. Not because a bomb fell, but because a message was sent. This hemisphere has an owner. When Marco Rubio said, "This is the Western Hemisphere, this is where we live," he wasn't improvising. He was restating a doctrine. And in that instant, Latin America stopped being a region. It became a front line. For China, this was a shock, not to its trade figures, not to its loans, but to its assumptions. Because influence built with $518 billion in trade and $303 billion in financing still fractures when hard power enters the room. This is not about Venezuela alone. It's about who decides the rules, who enforces them, and who pays the price. If this analysis helps you see the world more clearly, stay with me, because what happened next changes how power works in the 21st century. And to understand that, we have to define the real problem first. At first glance, this looks like a regional dispute, a US strike, a sanctioned state, a familiar confrontation. But that reading is dangerously shallow, because the real issue is not Venezuela. The real issue is whether Latin America is allowed to choose its own economic future, or whether geography still determines destiny. For 2 decades, China treated the region as an open system, trade without troops, loans without alliances, infrastructure without ideology, at least on paper. The United States never accepted that premise. Washington does not see capital flows. It sees strategic penetration. Ports become leverage. Loans become dependence. Supply chains become vulnerabilities. So when China says this is not anyone's backyard, the US hears a challenge to the post-war order it built. This is not a misunderstanding. It is a structural collision. And to grasp why it was inevitable, we need to go back to how this relationship began. To understand how we arrived here, you have to zoom out, not years, decades. After the Cold War, Latin America entered a vacuum. US attention drifted elsewhere. Wars in the Middle East, crises in Europe, the rise of Asia. Into that silence, China moved methodically, not with ideology, with contracts. Between 2000 and 2023, Chinese institutions extended an estimated $303 billion in financing across the region. Oil for loans, copper for credit, infrastructure for access. By 2024, trade reached a record $518 billion. No troops, no bases, just balance sheets. For many governments, this felt like liberation, an alternative to Washington, without lectures, without conditions. But economics never travels alone. Supply chains create dependence. Debt creates leverage. Currency creates alignment. And slowly, what looked like cooperation began to resemble strategy. That tension was building long before the first strike, and then it surfaced violently. Then came the rupture. The US attack on Venezuela was not just military action. It was a stress test for Caracas, for Beijing, for every capital watching quietly. Only a year earlier, China and Venezuela had announced a strategic partnership. On paper, it looked formidable. Energy ties, diplomatic support, shared defiance of US pressure. But when US forces moved, China did not. No deterrence, no counterweight, no protection of assets. The seizure of Russian-flagged oil tankers made the signal even clearer. Hard power still sets boundaries. Across Latin America, policymakers took note, not of China's promises, but of their limits. Influence built on finance does not automatically translate into security, and prestige, once shaken, travels fast. If you're trying to understand why regional leaders recalibrated their bets, this moment matters, because it reveals something uncomfortable. China could fund the system, but it could not defend it, And that realization opened the door to a much deeper question about what really holds this order together. What this exposed was not weakness, it was design. China's presence in Latin America was never built for confrontation. It was built for interdependence. Loans bind future output. Trade locks in supply chains. Ports reshape logistics. Power without visibility. Influence without uniforms. Beijing calls this win-win cooperation. Washington calls it strategic encroachment. This is where the systems diverge. The United States projects power through control. Control of finance, control of technology, control of security guarantees. China projects power through integration. But integration has a flaw. It assumes stability. It assumes rules. It assumes restraint by others. The moment force enters the equation, that model is exposed. Because debt cannot deter missiles, and contracts cannot stop seizures. This is why the US national security strategy speaks of hidden costs, espionage, cyber risk, strategic dependency, not as technical warnings, but as justification for pushback. What we are witnessing is not a clash of nations, it is a clash of architectures. And when architectures collide, something else follows: pressure, escalation, and a second crisis, one with far broader consequences. The second shock did not come from bombs, it came from oil. For years, Venezuela repaid Chinese loans with barrels, not cash. Energy was the glue holding that relationship together. Then Washington moved to control it. Suddenly, 2 Chinese supertankers turned back mid-journey, not because of a blockade, but because of uncertainty. Who owns the oil now? Who honors the debt? Who absorbs the loss? If supplies are cut, Chinese banks do not protest. They write off billions. And that changes calculations, because China still has leverage, not in Caracas, but elsewhere. Rare earths, critical minerals, market access, tools that do not make headlines until they stop flowing. This is how proxy pressure works. No direct war, no formal retaliation, just friction applied at pressure points. Manufacturing slows, costs rise, trust erodes. This is the danger zone, where economic weapons replace military ones, and where miscalculation spreads fast, especially for countries caught in between. Which brings us to the people who feel this first, not in boardrooms, but in daily life. For you, this is not theory. You don't live in a policy paper. You live in prices, in jobs, in uncertainty. When big powers collide, it is never abstract. Supply chains break, currencies wobble, investment freezes. A port delayed means fewer exports. A loan suspended means a project abandoned. And suddenly, growth slows without warning. Governments promise stability. Markets promise efficiency. But neither protects you when rivalry overrides economics. This is the hidden cost of becoming strategically important. Not prosperity, pressure. Latin America is being forced to choose, even when it doesn't want to. Choose partners, choose currencies, choose sides, and every choice narrows the future. If this analysis resonates, if you felt this tension in your own country, your own work, your own life, pause here, share this perspective, because understanding power is the first defense against it. And the next question matters even more, because what happens here does not stay here. It ripples outward, across oceans, alliances, and the global balance itself. What unfolds in Latin America does not remain regional for long, because this is not just about trade routes, it's about rules. When the United States tightens its grip on what it calls its hemisphere, other regions take notes. So does China. If ports can be questioned, if loans can be politicized, if oil can be seized, then no overseas asset is ever truly neutral. That logic travels. From Peru's Chancay megaport with its potential for dual use, to the proposed bioceanic corridor, an $80 billion railway linking the Pacific to the Atlantic, infrastructure becomes suspicion, connectivity becomes risk. Even the Panama Canal, once a symbol of global transit, is pulled back into strategic calculation. This is how rivalry globalizes, not through treaties, through precedent. Every move in Latin America reshapes expectations in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East. A world where access is conditional, where neutrality shrinks, and where middle powers learn a hard lesson, that in an age of rivalry, geography is no longer protection. It is exposure, which leaves only one question. Where does this end, and what futures are still possible from here? From here, the future does not branch once. It branches 3 times. First, a managed rivalry. The US asserts boundaries. China adapts quietly. Trade continues, but ambition narrows. Latin America hedges. Projects slow, but collapse is avoided. Stability survives. Thin, fragile, negotiated daily. Second, a fractured balance. Pressure intensifies. Loans become liabilities. Infrastructure becomes contested terrain. Countries are forced to align, not loudly, but decisively. Growth continues, but unevenly. Politicized, conditional. Third, the dangerous path. Retaliation spirals. Oil is weaponized. Minerals are restricted. Assets are seized. Proxy conflicts emerge, not with soldiers, but with sanctions, supply shocks, and sudden ruptures. This is not inevitability. It is structure meeting choice. Systems reward restraint until they don't. And the lesson of history is brutally consistent. When great powers redraw boundaries, those in between pay first. Which is why the final insight matters. Because understanding this moment is not about prediction, it's about preparation. This is the mistake many make. They think this story is about Venezuela. It isn't. It's about a world where power is no longer hidden, where money is strategic, infrastructure is political, and neutrality is treated as a liability. The United States is signaling that spheres of influence are back. China is learning that economic reach does not equal control. And Latin America, like many regions, is discovering that being connected also means being vulnerable. The 21st century will not be shaped by ideology alone. It will be shaped by who controls choke points, who enforces rules, and who absorbs the shocks when systems collide. If you want to understand the world as it is, not as it's marketed, stay here. Subscribe, share this analysis, and join me in the next video where we examine how economic warfare is quietly replacing traditional war and why almost no country is prepared for it.